Ukraine just made a move few expected. Not on the battlefield, not in Europe, but in the heart of the Middle East. A mutually beneficial defense deal, like with Saudi Arabia. At first glance, it sounds routine. Another agreement, another headline. But it isn't. Because this deal doesn't just connect Kyiv and Riyadh. It redraws the strategic map around them. And more importantly, it signals something much larger already in motion. Something that goes beyond Ukraine's war, beyond oil, beyond regional alliances. Because when a country fighting a high-intensity war reaches across continents to deepen defense ties, it's not improvisation, it's calculation. And this is where it gets interesting. Saudi Arabia is not just another partner. It sits at the intersection of energy power, global finance, and shifting security alignments. For years, it balanced between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, carefully, deliberately. Ukraine entering that equation changes the geometry. Quietly, but significantly. So the real question is not what this deal is, it's why now. Why does Ukraine need Saudi Arabia at this stage of the war? And why would Saudi Arabia step closer to a conflict that, until now, it has kept at arm's length? Because deals like this are rarely about what's written on paper. They are about positioning for what comes next. And what happens next is the real story. This didn't happen overnight. Ukraine's outreach to Saudi Arabia is the result of a slow, deliberate shift that began long before this deal was announced. At the start of the war, Ukraine's strategy was clear. Secure maximum support from the West. Weapons, funding, intelligence, all flowing primarily from the United States and Europe. And for a time, that worked. But as the war dragged on, something began to change. Western unity held, but momentum slowed. Aid became more political, more conditional, more uncertain. And Ukraine adapted. It started looking beyond its traditional allies, toward countries that had stayed neutral or strategically ambiguous. Countries like Saudi Arabia. Now consider Saudi Arabia's position during this same period. Riyadh maintained a careful balance. It avoided direct involvement. It kept communication channels open with both the West and Russia. It focused on energy markets, OPEC plus coordination, and regional priorities. But beneath that neutrality, a pattern was forming. Saudi Arabia was expanding its global influence, not through confrontation, but through strategic partnerships. It hosted diplomatic talks. It engaged in prisoner exchanges. It positioned itself as a mediator, not a participant, at least not openly. And this is where the trajectories begin to intersect. Ukraine needs diversified support, not just military, but economic and diplomatic. Saudi Arabia wants expanded geopolitical relevance, beyond oil, beyond the Middle East. So when these two paths cross, it isn't random, it's alignment. But this is where it gets complicated, because this deal isn't happening in isolation. It's happening at a moment when global power structures are already shifting to middle solitary, or powers are gaining leverage, and traditional alliances are being tested, which raises a deeper question. Is Ukraine simply expanding its network, or is it actively reshaping the geopolitical playing field? Because what happens next will depend on that answer. On the surface, the agreement is framed simply: a mutually beneficial defense deal, technical cooperation, potential arms collaboration, shared expertise. Nothing overtly dramatic. But the details, barisi, chi, decross, isi, and isti, what's left unsaid. Darizer, Ispizori, Ixida Sopansi tell a different story. Ukraine is not just looking for weapons, it's looking for sustainability. Its defense industry has been under constant pressure, supply chains disrupted, infrastructure targeted, production stretched. Western aid fills gaps, but it doesn't fully solve the long-term problem. So Ukraine is shifting toward co-production, joint development, and external partnerships. Saudi Arabia fits into that strategy, not as a frontline military ally, but as a financial and industrial force. Riyadh has been investing heavily in defense manufacturing. It's safer, it's say to say there in the save on area chain and see you there bounds. To what localize production, reduce dependence on foreign suppliers, and build a domestic military industrial base. Ukraine brings something valuable to that equation. Battle-tested technology, operational experience, adaptability under pressure. But this is where the story shifts, because both sides are offering what the other lacks. Ukraine needs capital, scale, and stability. Saudi Arabia needs real-world defense expertise, and that creates a transactional alignment. Yet the ambiguity matters. There are no clear disclosures about the depth of cooperation, no specifics on weapon systems, no timeline for implementation. And that uncertainty is not accidental. It gives both sides flexibility and deniability, because stepping too far too fast Especially for Saudi Arabia, carries risks, relations with Russia, energy coordination, regional stability. So the deal is designed to move forward without appearing to move too fast. But here's the tension. When defense cooperation deepens, it rarely stays limited. It expands, quietly at first, then structurally. And that raises the stakes, because what looks like a limited agreement today could evolve into something far more consequential tomorrow. Type continue to generate the next section. Continue to generate the next section. This deal matters because of where it sits, not just geographically, but strategically. Ukraine is extending its reach beyond Europe, into a region that has traditionally operated under a completely different security architecture. The Middle East is not NATO territory. It doesn't function on alliance guarantees or collective defense. It operates on leverage, flexibility, strategic ambiguity, and Saudi Arabia is at the center of that system, which means Ukraine is no longer playing on a single board. It's expanding the game. But why does that matter? Because wars are not only fought on battlefields, they are sustained through networks, supply chains, financing, political backing, and Ukraine is building redundancy into all three. If Western support slows or fractures, Ukraine needs alternatives, not replacements, buffers, and Saudi Arabia offers exactly that. Financial depth, industrial ambition, global influence. Now flip the perspective. For Saudi Arabia, this is about positioning. It is actively transforming its defense posture, moving from a buyer of weapons to a producer, from dependence to autonomy. Ukraine accelerates that transition. Real combat insight, rapid innovation cycles, lessons from modern warfare that no simulation can replicate. But this is where the stakes rise, because every strategic expansion creates friction. And this deal intersects with multiple fault lines. Russia, a key energy partner for Saudi Arabia, the United States, a long-term security guarantor, China, an emerging strategic collaborator in the region. So Saudi Arabia isn't just engaging Ukraine, it's recalibrating its position across all three, carefully, incrementally, but deliberately. And that's why this changes the game. Because once a country like Saudi Arabia starts integrating into a live conflict ecosystem, even indirectly, it shifts the balance. Not instantly, but structurally. And structural shifts are the ones that last, which leads to the next layer. What are both sides really trying to achieve? Because the visible strategy is only part of the story. Strip away the headlines and a clearer pattern emerges. This is not about a single deal, it's about strategic insurance. From Ukraine's perspective, the logic is precise. Wars of this scale are not won by short-term supply, they are won by endurance. And endurance requires diversification. Military analysts increasingly focus on one constraint: sustainability of force. Not just how many weapons Ukraine receives, but how reliably it can maintain, repair, and reproduce them over time. That's the gap Ukraine is trying to close. And Saudi Arabia offers a pathway, not as a battlefield partner, but as a stabilizer, a country capable of injecting capital, hosting production, and supporting long-term defense infrastructure outside the immediate reach of the war. In other words, Ukraine is externalizing part of its defense ecosystem. Now shift to Saudi Arabia. The kingdom's strategy has been evolving for years. Reduce dependence on Western arms. Build domestic capability. Project influence beyond energy. But there's a limitation. Most of its defense partnerships lack real combat feedback loops. Ukraine changes that. It brings live, evolving battlefield knowledge, drone warfare, electronic warfare, rapid adaptation under pressure. This is not theoretical learning. It's iterative, real-time military evolution. And this is where expert thinking converges. When a capital-rich state partners with a war-tested military, the result is not static cooperation. It's acceleration, faster development cycles, faster adaptation, faster strategic learning. But there's a second layer, less visible, more consequential. This partnership also signals a shift in how influence is built. Not through alliances alone, but through capability networks. Flexible, cross-regional, and harder to disrupt. And this is where it becomes bigger than Ukraine or Saudi Arabia. Because if this model works, others will follow. But the other side tells a different story. From this perspective, the deal is being overstated. Not a strategic shift, just a limited engagement, a symbolic agreement designed to signal cooperation without fundamentally changing the balance. Because Saudi Arabia has a history of calculated ambiguity. It engages broadly, but commits narrowly. It hosts talks, signs agreements, expands dialogue, yet avoids deep entanglement in active conflicts. And there are clear constraints. Russia remains a critical partner in energy coordination. The United States still underpins Saudi security architecture, and China is becoming an increasingly important economic and technological partner. Moving too close to Ukraine risks disrupting all three. So, the argument goes, this deal is designed to look significant without actually becoming significant. A controlled signal, not a structural shift. There's also skepticism about implementation. Defense agreements are easy to sign, much harder to execute. They require alignment on technology transfer, legal frameworks, production logistics, and political will. And in this case, each layer carries friction. Ukraine is at war. Saudi Arabia is balancing multiple global relationships, which creates a natural ceiling on how far cooperation can go. But this is where the narrative becomes uncertain, because limited engagements have a pattern. They start small. Technical exchanges, pilot projects, quiet coordination. Then, under the right conditions, they expand. And often, by the time that expansion becomes visible, the foundation is already in place. So the real question isn't whether this deal is big today. It's whether it becomes big tomorrow, because if it does, the consequences won't remain contained. Global consequences: if this partnership deepens, the impact won't stay regional. It will ripple outward, across markets, alliances, and the structure of global power itself. Start with energy. Saudi Arabia is not just a regional actor. It is a central node in global oil markets. Its coordination with Russia through OPEC Plus has already reshaped supply dynamics and price stability. Now introduce Ukraine into that equation. Even indirectly, it creates a subtle but important overlap between energy strategy and war dynamics. Not immediately disruptive, but strategically sensitive. Because any shift in Saudi positioning, even a gradual one, forces recalculations in Moscow. Now move to defense. If Ukraine successfully externalizes parts of its defense production, it changes the logic of modern warfare. War economies become more distributed, less vulnerable to direct strikes, harder to disrupt. And if Saudi Arabia becomes part of that network, it signals something larger. Defense ecosystems are no longer confined to alliances. They are becoming globalized, flexible, adaptive. Then there's the alliance layer. The United States has long been the primary security partner for both Ukraine and Saudi Arabia, but in very different ways. Now those two relationships begin to intersect, not through Washington, but around it. And that introduces complexity, because it suggests a world where partners don't just align vertically with superpowers. They connect horizontally with each other, independently. And this is where it becomes personal, because these shifts don't stay abstract. Entonces they affect oil prices, supply chains, defense spending, global stability. The cost of uncertainty increases, gradually at first, then all at once. And this leads directly to the final question. Where does this go from here? Because the next phase is not about what has happened. It's about what is now set in motion. This is where trajectories begin to separate, because from here, the path is no longer singular. It splits. Two scenarios, both plausible, both already in motion. The first is gradual escalation. The partnership deepens quietly. Technical cooperation expands into joint production. Pilot projects become infrastructure. Saudi Arabia begins integrating select Ukrainian defense technologies, drones, electronic warfare systems, rapid repair frameworks. Nothing dramatic, nothing public, but cumulative. Over time, Ukraine secures a more resilient, distributed defense network, less dependent on any single region, harder to disrupt. And Saudi Arabia accelerates its transition into a serious defense producer, not just a buyer. If this path continues, the result is subtle but powerful. A new model of wartime cooperation, flexible, cross-regional, built on mutual capability. And others will notice. The second scenario is controlled containment. The deal remains limited. Symbolic cooperation, minimal execution. Saudi Arabia maintains its balancing act. keeping equal distance from Washington, Moscow, and emerging partners. Ukraine gains diplomatic value, but little structural change. In this version, the system absorbs the move without transforming. But here's the critical point. Both scenarios are unstable, because external pressure will shape the outcome. If the war intensifies, if Western support fluctuates, if global alignments continue to fragment, then the incentive to deepen this partnership increases rapidly. And that shifts probability toward expansion. So the real answer isn't which scenario is more likely today. It's which conditions emerge tomorrow. Because this deal is not an endpoint. It's an opening move. And like most opening moves in geopolitics, Report is already changed. Or if you want to understand those shifts of the episode, subscribe to GeoBrief, because the next move is already being prepared.